About halfway through, I thought to myself, hey, this is going pretty well. And then I made a mistake. The hardest thing I think for this one in general is how everything kind of looks the same. No dynamic markings. It's just a bunch of 16th notes. And it's really easy to get lost in the page. This is what happened to me when I made my mistake. I kind of was doing a good job of pacing myself and my reading. You know, I was looking like just the right amount ahead and not losing track of where I was. And then I think I tried to look too far ahead to prepare myself for what was coming next, and it was too much. But what makes this really hard, playing at the slower tempo, is preserving a good moderate tempo staccato. Staccato is always easier, faster, because you have that momentum. You don't really have to focus so much on the end of each note because you're kind of bouncing from one to the next. But the slower it is, the more time there is between notes, which means you can really hear if your note endings aren't good. The faster you are, the more you just kind of focus on note beginnings, and then when you're slower, you have to round off those staccato notes before you go on to the next one. To make it even more challenging, I'm going to play it again, but I'm going to go quite a bit slower. Even though I was already at the slow end of the tempo range, I'm going to go back to 60 where I played the last one, and try it again with the tempo on this time. Almost made it to the end without making a mistake. But as you can hear, breathing is also a challenging through here. I was grabbing lots of little breaths, but definitely feeling like I was going to be a bit winded when I got to the end. Last line. So I hope that illustrates my point. It gets a bit harder the slower you go to do a nice staccato. I'm sure you could hear there
that sounded okay, but then some that weren't so much. I want to have a quick look here at the height to see what he had to say about breathing. And the obvious places, of course, the 16th rest. Normally, I avoid the 16th rest for breaths and wait for a longer rest, but in this one, you don't have much of that. So, and I think this is a case of it being a good idea to remind ourselves on the rest to take a good breath, like our best breath, because we're not going to have much time. I don't have very good memory of where I breathed when I was doing it, so it's possible that I made some of the same choices, but it's also possible that my choices were quite different. But I didn't necessarily love any of the breathing choices I made, so I am open to trying Mr. Heights. There's a real art to being able to take these quick breaths and take a lot of them. I'm going to go back to the lower end of that tempo range at 72, but I'm going to keep the metronome on for a bit because I like to use the metronome when I'm plotting breaths, because once I'm playing it for real, I can manipulate the time in a musical way to make sure I have time to get a good breath in. But I like to kind of practice almost shoehorning the breaths in with the metronome so that I don't lose the flow and that I get to know how the piece should flow a little bit better before I start making musical adjustments to accommodate the breaths. I'm going to go back to the top of this one, but with the metronome. That one's weird. I don't think I'm going to do that. Normally, I would agree with Mr. Height and want to take the breaths like kind of after a downbeat. But for this one, I don't think so. I think I want to try and put them at the end of bars as much as possible. You know, I'm actually going to do that because I think ultimately I would put in just a tiny bit of pullback there to insert that breath, and I think that would be more musical. So I did make a mistake there with fingers, so I want to fix that. So I want to do right, left, right. So that's one spot I also want to check in the height. When I played it the first time, it threw me because I wasn't sure if it was right. Where is that bar? No, that's right. Because it was the other time when he repeated a note, Height changed it. I think it could be either. I think I'm just going to stick with the original for now. Okay, so I'm going to work some more from the beginning on some of these breaths, but I also want to add in some dynamics. I feel like I'm going to try my best to approach this as if it would be something I would play on a recital and not an exam. In Height's edition, he adds a lot of dynamic markings typically. The only ones he adds this time are here, and then here. Oh, I missed one. Right there. And then that's it. That is all he added in terms of dynamic markings. But in his notes at the beginning, he recommends practicing this all dynamic levels from pianissimo to fortissimo, which is 100% valid because on clarinet, I can't speak to other wind instruments, but for sure on clarinet, I don't feel like I know enough about flute to speak to this at this point, but the way you're using your air, and especially in terms of different dynamic levels, is going to impact the way you articulate. So it's going to feel different. The goal is for it to always sound the same, but playing more here, it's going to feel very different than. Yeah, that was a bit harsh on the staccato, which this reed I'm playing on right now is definitely much better suited for softer dynamic. But if I'm doing my job right, playing the staccato at any dynamic marking, it's all going to sound the same, just louder or softer. But the sensation of creating that sound is going to be a bit different, because it's kind of hard to zero in on what exactly changes, because it's like, of course, the way you use your air is different when you're playing a louder volume versus a softer volume. There's almost like a higher pressure when it's softer, more control when it's softer. At a softer volume, your tongue can be a bit lighter on the articulation, and the louder you get, you have to do a bit more, but then the challenge becomes not letting it get too harsh. So I'm going to try and keep it more just like mezzo forte with some ebb and flow. Also, let me add in the tempo range here. The height edition calls for 72 to 104. And then oops, I made a mistake. But I like that little bit of a decrescendo there. And I feel like the crescendo is not a lot. It's just enough to kind of bring us back. Yeah, so I was able to I did grab that breath after all. So I'm going to put it back in like parentheses. I like the more musical one that I wrote in better, even though I didn't execute it correctly. Okay, so something I thought of that made me make a mistake because my thoughts went elsewhere is an important thing to do on a study or a piece of music like this is to remember to breathe out as much as you're breathing in. Because when you're doing a staccato exercise, you're not expending the same amount of air that you would playing like a bunch of long tones. And it's really easy to see this and think, oh, breathing's going to be a challenge. I need to make sure that I get enough breaths in. And then you end up with feeling a bit like you're going to hyperventilate, right? You've inhaled too much. And I know for me, it presents as like feeling desperately like I need to sigh it out, just like really let it go. So I am going to mark my exhales with like an asterisk as a reminder that on those bigger rests, I'm not just going to breathe in, I'm also going to, or that's really the only one. But when I get to that spot, I wish it was a bit further down the page, but it's not. But I'm going to make a point to breathe out any extra air I'm hanging on to before I breathe in again. So I'm going to go back to the beginning and put those little pieces together. That up, but same thing there. I think I'm going to keep that breath that he wrote in, but I'm going to need a bit of pullback right before. And for now, I'm leaving a bigger gap because I want to realign with the metronome. Without the metronome, it'll just be a bit out of time, but I won't have to wait for the next click. So I go back to the line before, after that 16th rest. Yeah, I'm going to breathe there as well. I'm going to do the same thing there. Pull it back just a little bit, but breathe after the F sharp that time. So I'm going to take out this one. I didn't end up using that. And I'm going to also pull back there, but I want to crescendo into that. I don't want it to come back too much. And I'd rather not breathe between those last two Bs, but I could grab one there if I needed just a little bit more to make that octave transition nicely. On that note, I'm going to go a little bit faster. Let's go 10 clicks faster, 82, and see what happens with breaths this time. Oh, did I do that wrong? No, I had it right the first time. As you can hear, like this, I definitely need to practice a bit to work up faster. Yeah, so I need to work on that one a bit if I want it faster. If I need to work it faster, I'm not going to worry about the breaths so much in the beginning. I'm going to just stop and take a breath when I need to and come back in and keep working until I get the tempo up where I need it to be. And then when I feel like I have controlled the fingers and good note memory at the tempo that I want to be performance tempo, then I will go back and reevaluate the breathing situation. I would probably do what I've done today and kind of give myself the lay of the land, you know, with some idea of where will be a good spot to breathe. Practice that, work on getting it faster, kind of ignoring those breaths, like not completely, but with less of a focus on breathing in the correct spot and more of just working towards that tempo and maintaining good flow and staying in charge of my technique and making sure my fingers stay organized and they're in the right place at the right time. And then once I felt like I was secure there, then I would go back and edit my breathing appropriately. I'm going to go back to original tempo, 72. And I'm going to try and play it through without the metronome this time, but keeping those breaths in the correct place. really need to improve on here is not rushing, because I did get faster as I went on. I'm sure you heard me somewhere around middle of the page where I had that biggest moment to take a breath, that I started back a bit slower, which is what I recommend. If you're playing something like this in exam, in performance, and you find that you're just rushing and you feel like you're tumbling downhill a bit, when you have a moment, when you have a breath, phrase break, go ahead and like reel it back in. I had a teacher advise me that when I'm playing something like this, if I feel like I'm running out of air, then the solution is to imagine myself getting taller and like wider, bigger, broader. And that when you do that, you'll find more air because you're kind of relaxing. If you think about like when you feel like you're desperate for breath, you kind of start to like collapse and crunch inwards. And that actually is going to make it harder to breathe, right? And harder to create a good sound. But if you think of the opposite and kind of like pull yourself like up and away, you'll find a little bit more air left that you didn't realize you had. Am I always good at remembering and doing that? No, of course not. Especially if my adrenaline is really kicking in or I'm at all anxious in that moment. But I think it is really helpful when I can remember it. So I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. But let me go back and play this one once through.